Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 170, June 17th to June 23rd, 1864. Last week, we spent time in West Central Virginia fighting the Battle of Trevilian Station, as well as the battles of Piedmont and Lynchburg. Trevilian Station will show that the Confederate cavalry is still very much alive in the main theater of the war, albeit kind of the swan song, so to speak. And Lynchburg will be another parry to the Federal operations in the Valley. Forrest will add to his win total in the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads. This week we need to head back to Lee and Grant and check out what they've been doing following the Battle of Cold Harbor. Before we do that, though, speaking of Cold Harbor and speaking of the Patreon, we do have a picture slideshow that should be posted to the Patreon feed going over Cold Harbor, right? One of the better battlefields, I think, in terms of earthworks. If you really like earthworks, you really should check out Cold Harbor, and I have some pictures up online that show you what the modern-day battlefield looks like. And coming up here, we're just around the corner from July, so we will be posting another Patreon item. This one's going to be a movie review, and we're going to do Cold Mountain. And I know the Battle of the Crater isn't until the end of July, but that's such a prominent part in that movie, albeit it's not a very long part of the movie. The Crater, pretty nice imagery, so I just want to go over that. We'll talk a little bit about the Crater and talk about then the rest of the movie. There's some other themes we need to cover. If any of that sounds like it would be interesting to you, though, whether it's our picture slideshows, our movie reviews, we have some memoir reviews, we've done John Singleton Mosby in the past, among some others. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. When we last left off in Virginia, we had fought the Battle of Cold Harbor. While the significance of the battle is up in the air, post the assaults on June 3rd, the two armies will halt. Grant is going to try to figure out exactly where to go. It would be at this point in the campaign where the emphasis will shift to eliminating the supply lines for the Army of Northern Virginia. Lynchburg, which we talked about in a previous episode, was a key spot because 3 rail lines intersected there. This would be why it was a target for David Hunter, even though it's technically not in the Shenandoah Valley, and it would be still a good target. Grant is going to want to have that part of the action play out before he makes any further moves. The Army of the Potomac, meanwhile, as well as Butler's Army of the James, would set their sights on a similar target. Just to the south of Richmond lies the city of Petersburg. Petersburg at the time would have been the second largest city in Virginia, and it was strategic because it had a rail lifeline that led into the city. If you were to eliminate Petersburg, that would essentially cut off rail support to Richmond, or at least it would make it particularly difficult for an army to continue to operate, such as the Army of Northern Virginia. Ironically, George B. McClellan had this idea way back in 1862, although he might not have been able to execute it. This is because the only negative for this plan of action would be that shifting bases would be seen as a kind of defeat. It would seem to some that they were moving away from Richmond, and that's going to be a problem. Remember, we have the soldiers' morale to take into consideration. The Army of the Potomac is going to be filled with a lot of replacements. We have Lincoln's re-election campaign. So if you combine those two, it looks like we're retreating. Morale is going to be low. Any kind of correspondence back to the public of the North is going to talk about how you're losing. So that is going to be on Grant's mind. For the average soldiers, the reception is going to be mixed, though. Some applauded Grant, while others were not so keen. Especially sitting at their earthworks at Cold Harbor, it would seem to be a tough sell. artillery would occasionally open up, and the sharpshooters were going to be hard at work. The commander of the 7th New York Heavy Artillery, who was elevated to brigade command following Brooks' wounding in the 2nd Corps, would be killed by a sharpshooter during this lull in the action. Breckinridge would be hurt as a horse falls on him due to artillery, so there was still going to be things going on between the lines. All in all, both sides are going to attempt to consolidate. You start to read about the action after Cold Harbor and exactly what the armies are going to go through, what the soldiers' life is going to be like. Remember, it is going to be hot. June in Virginia is hot, and you're going to have all kinds of earthworks now. So it is going to be very reminiscent, some of these accounts that you read of trench warfare in World War I. And I know I've mentioned this before. This kind of goes back to the point that the Civil War, the American Civil War, is going to be the first modern war because of these kinds of tactics that start to roll out. And again, it's a pretty interesting transition when you get into the First World War. Now, obviously, the weaponry is going to be quite different. The technology is going to be different by the time we get to 1914. But if you compare the two side by side, if you take out any references to just where you're at in history, and you have two accounts, it probably is going to sound fairly similar. So it is a good comparison. Grant is going to write about his decision on the next course of action. A full survey of all the ground satisfies me that it would not be practicable to hold a line northeast of Richmond that would protect the Fredericksburg Railroad, to enable us to use it for supplying the army. To do so would give us a long, vulnerable line of road to protect, exhausting much of our strength in guarding it, and would leave open to the enemy all of his lines of communication on the south side of the James. My idea from the start has been to beat Lee's army, if possible, north of Richmond, then, after destroying his lines of communication north of the James River, to transfer the army to the south side and besiege Lee in Richmond, or follow him south if he should retreat. I now find, after more than 30 days of trial, that the enemy deems it for the first importance to run no risk with the armies they now have. They act purely on the defensive behind breastworks, or feebly on the offensive immediately in front of them, where in case of repulse they can instantly retire behind them. Without a greater sacrifice of human life than I am willing to make, all cannot be accomplished that I had designed outside of the city. I have, therefore, resolved upon the following plan. I will continue to hold substantially the ground now occupied by the Army of the Potomac, taking advantage of any favorable circumstance that may present itself, until the cavalry can be sent west to destroy the Virginia Central Railroad from about Beaver Dam for some 25 or 30 miles west. When this is effective, I will move the army to the south side of the James River, either by crossing the Chickahominy and marching near to City Point, or by going to the mouth of the Chickahominy on the north side and crossing there. To provide for this last and most probable contingency, 6 or more ferry boats of the largest class ought to be immediately provided. Once on the south side of the James River, I can cut off all sources of supply to the enemy, except what is furnished by the canal. If Hunter succeeds in reaching Lynchburg, that would be lost to him also. Should Hunter not succeed, I will still make the effort to destroy the canal by sending cavalry up the south side of the river with a pontoon train to cross wherever they can. The feeling of the two armies now seems to be that the rebels can protect themselves only by strong entrenchments, while our army is not only confident of protecting itself without entrenchments, but that it can beat and drive the enemy wherever and whenever he can be found without this protection. So obviously a couple of things to unpack here from Grant. He is obviously stymied by the Confederates. We've had 40 days, shall we say. There's always this kind of frame of these 40 days that the campaigns, overland campaign rolls out into. And obviously he has not been able to capture Richmond, so that's going to be a problem. So now he's kind of trying to sugarcoat his words here a little bit in not really admitting defeat or admitting failure, but he is saying, hey, the rebels are at a spot where I can beat them. they're going to be behind these entrenchments. He still doesn't really think a whole lot of Lee's offensive capability, and, whether that's correct or not, Lee is certainly not going to have the manpower to really have a true offensive action, the kinds of which he has launched previously in the war. So obviously that is going to be something that, whether Grant actually knows that or not, he is sort of right on that assumption. You all, of course, remember that Sheridan will be riding out to the Virginia Central Railroad and will be chased down by Hampton. Unbeknownst to Grant, Hunter likewise will not make the rendezvous, eventually withdrawing and getting sidelined once again. In the meantime, the troops will remain in their defenses around Cold Harbor. Now we have a little saga between Grant and Lee involving a truce to pick up the dead and dying. The conditions in Virginia were not going to be so good for anyone trapped in the no man's land, and sniping would make rescue attempts quite deadly. We know that there were large assaults conducted by the Union Army on June 3rd. It would not be until June 7th that a truce would be called to collect the dead and save any of the remaining wounded. Of course, by this time, most of the wounded had expired, so there were very little in terms of individuals being brought in. Both sides would have men stuck outside the lines, as there had been a brief Confederate counterattack that resulted much in the same way that the Federal assaults had. This had been conducted by Floridians under Finnegan and also some North Carolinians. But why exactly did it take so long? Well, there are several factors. Grant is usually characterized as being a butcher for delaying, but really he had a good reason to. He was concerned about continuing the campaign, and likewise a truce on his part, as Lee wanted to have, would imply that he had been defeated. Lee, on the other hand, will be too formal in his requests, wanting an army-wide truce instead of isolated local truces, as was originally suggested. Whatever the case, the two sides would agree, and June 7th would mark the soldiers going out to meet and talk with one another. Burial parties were given alcohol to help in their cleanup efforts, as many bodies were quite along in the decomposition process. Even after the truce was considered to be over, many sectors of the line, especially on the 2nd Corps, Gibbon's front, would continue to have informal truces. Officers would become lax, and the two sides would exchange newspapers outside of their earthworks. Whenever one side would prepare to fire, they would yell to the other, and any first shots were intentionally high. But it was not always as such along the lines. In some places, the truce was never really taking hold. This would notably be in the northern end, where Burnside's corps was situated to anchor the flank. He had refused his line, and Early had probed toward him, with little effect. Early would get into it with Anderson on the rebel side, and Burnside would quarrel with Warren on the Union side. Tensions were definitely high. Union troops were eager to continue moving. Grant had heard that Hunter had seen some success, so he had assigned his aides to find a suitable crossing of the James River, which would be a problem, as it would require a large amount of pontoons. As these were being gathered, Lee would write that the best chance that they would have is to catch him in the act of crossing. Now, Lee is probably right in this assumption, but he would have not the men to do it. Had it been a previous year, or even the beginning of May, he might have been all right. The armies were really shadows of their former selves. The Army of the Potomac, as mentioned, was full of replacement soldiers, and the Army of Northern Virginia was so depleted, and no help was going to be on the way. Lee was going to be forced to occupy his lines around Cold Harbor and rely on Beauregard, whose command had been bottling up Butler at Bermuda 100 on a line known as the Howlett Line. Beauregard would have control of the South and would be responsible for letting Lee know if there had been a massive shift in forces, which we know now is in the works. June 9th, meanwhile, would see Butler make yet another failed attempt at Petersburg. As we know, Grant was very eager to get across the James and then proceed on the key railroad town. Combine that with the elimination of the Virginia Central and to make the situation untenable for Lee. Benjamin Butler, and to a lesser extent Quincy Gilmore, were trying to beat Grant to the punch. They believed they could accomplish the task without the Army of the Potomac crossing to the south side of the James. Gilmore would be tasked with leading brigades of Howley and the black troops under Hinks, while August Kautz would hit the city from the south. 4,500 men total would be tasked with this mission. June 9th would see this more than capable task force go up against Henry Wise and Raleigh Colston, who had only a handful of defenders for militia units, these being men either too old or too young for service or having specialized occupations. As the other operations in this part of the campaign conducted by Butler, the attack was going to be a failure. On paper, it should have been really essentially a walkover. The rebel defenses around Petersburg were known as the Dimmock Line, and they were in bad repair. Gilmore, for some reason, would divide his command into two parts, picking a spot in the Confederate line that way it was necessary to do so, and in the process, there would not really be an assault in his sector. He was facing far fewer militia and a small amount of rebel cavalry, who, to be fair, were acting aggressively in their skirmishing, making it seem like there were more men in the defenses. August Kautz, meanwhile, would overrun militia to the south, using the 1st DC Cavalry, armed with their Henry repeaters to great effect. A cavalry regiment and artillery from James Deering would arrive and stop the Federals before any real damage could be done. Overall, the mission was a failure, the First Battle of Petersburg being won by the Confederates, who mostly were not professional soldiers. Despite the setback, Grant was going to continue in his preparations to throw his army across the James. Moving out while his lines were so close to the enemy was going to be a tough task, though. While he had already maneuvered on several occasions during the campaign, in some places his troops could hear the rebels talking. Careful preparations were necessary, and secrecy, where the rebels could not be made aware, was going to be the name of the game. June 12th to 13th would mark his moving of the army not only to the James, but also crossing the Chickahominy, if you recall that being a fairly big obstacle. With Hancock leading the way along with the 18th Corps, the troops would quietly escape the earthworks around Cold Harbor and start their march early in the morning. Chapman's cavalry and Warren's 5th Corps, specifically Crawford's command, would be responsible for checking the Confederates at a place called Rydell's Shop, where roads converged. This would actually be the area around the old Glendale and Malvern Hill battlefields. Crawford and Chapman's cavalry would skirmish with parts of Rooney Lee's command and Wilcox with Heath as they probed toward the Union Army. You see, as the Federals moved out, Lee was made aware, but he was missing a large part of his command in Early, and what was more, he was going to have a hard time figuring out what Grant had in mind. The action at Rydell's screened the true movement of the Union Army, and it also would confuse the Confederates into thinking maybe the offensive would still happen north of the James River, as McClellan had attempted back in 1862. With Warren checking the Confederates and screening the advance, Hancock would fall with Wright and form defensively around the landing sites. Crucially, pontoons had been sent back to Fortress Monroe and were not on hand to have a smooth transition across the river. This delay would give the Confederates some valuable time. Still, many of the soldiers would welcome not being in their entrenchments around Cold Harbor. Henry Benham was going to complete a pontoon bridge that would be 2,000 feet long, the longest of its type. 12 men or 5 horses could pass across the width, so this was quite impressive. Grant would waste no time in starting the troops across. Andrew Humphreys had planned the routes of march, as he had done back in the beginning of the Overland Campaign, and the timetable was running like clockwork. With Hancock moving across the James and Smith joining Butler, I've seen Beauregard as being heavily criticized. There was intel that Smith was rejoining Butler along with the rest of the 10th Corps. However, not knowing that the Army of the Potomac was also making its way in the direction of the Cockade City was criminal. He was also calling for reinforcements from Lee, and to be fair, he was actually right in this regard. Henry Wise had been lucky only days before, and he knew it. What was more is that August Kautz with his cavalry had actually been able to have a pretty good understanding of what the Dimmock Line held in terms of their defenses, so they would have a pretty good plan of attack once the army was on hand. Lee, on the other hand, was aware that the Union Army was moving on to Harrison Landing, but was still not sure of their next move. While he had mentioned they needed to strike the enemy while he was still vulnerable, especially with Early gone, Lee was forced to be reactive, and leave the initiative to his opponent. Now, if Jubal Early's Second Corps, which we have mentioned, moves out to Lynchburg to deal with John Hunter, and then he's going to actually move up the valley, or down the valley, shall we say, and then he'll be going to pressure on to Washington here, and we'll get into that in a future episode. However, if Early had been there, would things have been truly different? I don't think they would have, but it would have given Lee a pretty sizable advantage once the army starts to cross, and if there really was an opportunity in this part of the campaign, it probably would have been right there. Grant would wish to waste no time in getting Hancock underway. He would press on to Petersburg with Smith. Meade, though, would not think that Hancock was going to be needed in the assault, so there was a miscommunication. Now, it should also be noted that Hancock mentions he has enough rations for his men under the assumption he's going to get new rations, whereas it could be read as he is fine regardless of the receipt of new rations at City Point. So, Meade is going to be confused by that as well. Meade should have clarified this point with Grant, but Grant thinks that the rations are not going to be needed. But Grant, on his part, is also going to make it seem like the Second Corps really isn't going to be all that valuable to operations. So, we have just miscommunications all around. So far, though, it should be pointed out that things are going pretty well for Grant. He's able to get across the river. Lee has not been alerted to that fact, that his army is now crossing the river. In fact, there's a famous quote where there's a problem, and then Grant says, if that's the only problem that we have, we're doing pretty good, right? And he has a point there. The pontoons had not been in the right spot, so there is a delay there, like we said. But getting across the river, and now Beauregard is having this kind of lapse in intelligence where he doesn't really understand that the Army of the Potomac has arrived. And very crucially, as we mentioned for Cold Harbor, a lot of the forces that had fought with him at Drury's Bluff and in the battles of the Bermuda Hundred campaign, a lot of those troops have been shifted north to help with Cold Harbor. So Beauregard doesn't have as many men. So if there is additional strength, you have the 18th Corps coming back into Butler's army of the James, and then if you have additional strength, you could really capitalize in a situation where Lee's not shifting any of his forces. So you really have an opportunity on the table. Hancock is also operating with a faulty map, the potential rendezvous point with the 18th Corps being behind current Confederate lines. In the meantime, Baldy Smith is going to attack Confederates at a place called Baylor's Farm. Facing against Deering's rebel cavalry would be Hinks and his United States colored troops. In what would be the first offensive action for black troops in the East, the regiments would assault the works, taking heavy casualties. Forcing Deering to retreat, Hinks would be happy with the performance of his troops. There are several great accounts of this fight at Baylor's Farm. The United States colored troops, remember, they have not seen combat before, so a lot of them are going to be acting like rookie regiments. They're going to be taking on artillery fire, pretty accurate artillery fire, but they are going to be able to assault these works, these outer defenses here at Baylor's Farm, and they will capture some cannon. And this is going to be a huge win for them. It's going to show their veteran comrades, their veteran white comrades, that they can fight, and obviously they have a trophy to show for it, albeit having taken on heavy casualties, pretty high toll to get there. But while that is the positive, the negative for Baldy Smith is going to be that with this stouter defense here, a little bit further out than he thought that he was going to actually meet the Confederates, he's going to become cautious. He's going to realize that, maybe there are more Confederates down here than there are, and I need to proceed slowly. Smith would be able to bring his entire 18th Corps on Henry Wise, who still only had half of Deering's cavalry brigade and the militia units, as well as 2 regiments and some artillery. The Dimmock line had been at least slightly repaired, so Wise still held an okay position. Initial approaches would be rebuffed with artillery and small arms fire, the Federals again taking on casualties. Couts and his cavalry would also not find success, advancing relatively in the same place that they had on the 9th. Now, Smith was unaware that the 2nd Corps was also able to support any attacks, so he did not immediately press, instead waiting for artillery, which had gone to the rear inexplicably. With Hancock suffering from his Gettysburg wound, David Birney would take over, although they were rushing to join him. Instead, Smith would reconnoiter the line and find a weak spot to attack. He would form his troops into a heavy skirmish line and assault the Dimmock line late in the day, taking Battery 5, a strong position. The Confederates would withdraw closer into the city, hoping that Robert Hoke and Bushrod Johnson would arrive to serve as reinforcements. Troops under Brooks, including the 13th New Hampshire, which was responsible for the breakthrough, and the United States colored troops, had performed well, both at the Dimmock line and at Baylor's Farm, and were commended for their actions. Even with these good performances, Baldy Smith, much like Quincy Gilmore, could have advanced into the city that night and thus avoided a long siege. That he did not is entirely on him. Grant and Meade had a miscommunication, and what was more, neither would take the situational control on the ground. While it's hard to believe that Beauregard was unaware of the crossing and Lee had been given the slip, there were also errors on the side of the Union. Smith had initially really dropped the ball, but so too did Meade, once he would be on the field to take over, as we will soon see. You can go to the modern-day Petersburg battlefield and see some of the batteries which the initial assaults take, and these are pretty strong positions, even if you don't have a whole lot of men to hold them, and especially if you have artillery. And one of the big changes in tactic here that Smith does that is actually pretty smart of him is he does just have a long skirmish line of men that moves up this hill and is able to take the artillery. And actually one of the officers that's captured, artillery officer of the Confederates, mentions how if I had known there weren't as many of you, I wouldn't have surrendered, right? So he does have this kind of shift in tactics. Obviously, advancing in these columns, attacking columns is going to be tough, and it's going to be really signal the Confederates that you're coming. So if you have this long skirmish line that moves up slowly and is able to take the work, then you're obviously not going to be suffering as many casualties as, say, you had at Baylor's Farm. Now, if the overland campaign did not end at Cold Harbor, it certainly ends once the armies reach Petersburg. With Smith and Hancock stalling and Beauregard reinforced to get his numbers up to 15,000 or so, it would seem as though the gears have shifted. I talked a little bit about the overland campaign in retrospective in a previous episode, so we will continue with the initial assaults on the city. Now Petersburg sits on the Appomattox River and the Weldon Railroad running up from the south. The Jerusalem Plank Road runs parallel to that, but a little to the east. The Boydton Plank Road runs to the west, and the Jordan Branch Road runs in from the east. June 16th would see Hancock commanding on the field temporarily, joined by Burnside and his 9th Corps, with Smith on the right, and the 2nd Corps in the center, and the 9th on the left. With this command, he would press the attack. Beauregard's men would perform well, now pressed with 50,000 attackers. They would delay the Union advance, inflicting heavy casualties. Francis Barlow would briefly break through the line, but a counterattack would drive him back. Patrick Kelly, who commanded the Irish Brigade at Gettysburg, would be killed by artillery during this action. Beauregard would build new earthworks closer into Petersburg in the meantime, eventually withdrawing past Harrison's Creek to a new line. On the 17th, they would be assaulted again, this time by several attacks from the 9th Corps. Parke would see his command with an early morning success. In fact, they were able to capture several Tennessee flags during their push, facing against Bushrod Johnson's command. The theme of the assaults by the Federals, though, is that they would see a general lack of support. There would be a pause from Parke's success to any kind of supporting action. Confederate artillery was able to enfilade Hartranft's division, and James Ledlie was supposed to be drunk during his assaults, just as he was at the Battle of North Anna. In fact, during this action, St. Clair Morton, who had been an engineering officer in the West, would order Hartranft's men to wheel by the right, exposing them to a devastating fire, which killed Morton in the process. Ledlie would form his men into an assault that would see some success in breaking the Confederate line. The rebels would be forced to refuse their ranks in certain areas to meet this threat. In fact, the lead elements of this attack would be for want of ammunition and call for aid. In so doing, they would alert the Confederates that they didn't have any ammunition, and so a counterattack would drive them away. Ledlie reportedly was so drunk that he was unaware he had a division to command, telling a fellow officer the troops could go to hell. Still, the rebels were forced to withdraw yet again to a new line. Now, if Meade had taken operational control of the situation and there had been a coordinated attack, we see that elements of the 9th Corps do see some success, but then that kind of fizzles out. The 2nd Corps sees a little bit of success, and then that fizzles out. If Meade had been able to coordinate some of these attacks, or somebody on the ground had been able to coordinate some of these attacks, then Beauregard's not going to have enough men to shift around, right? He only has 15,000 compared to, your 50,000 plus men that you are sending at him. And obviously, it's never going to be good to attack earthworks head on, but with just such an overwhelming force, it probably could have been possible, right? Now, we should also point out that the heavy campaigning is really taking its toll. Obviously, a lot of these veteran troops have been campaigning since early May, and they've been constantly fighting. They just got out of their Cold Harbor defenses, so now being thrown at Confederate earthworks is probably not going to be on the to-do list. In the meantime, Lee would finally react to Grant having crossed the river. The subject is going to be a tough one for Beauregard, who accuses Lee of lacking cooperation. Now, Beauregard is lacking the correct intelligence, but Rooney Lee would corroborate his story, leading Lee to send Kershaw and Field south to join the defense of Petersburg. It's actually a great account by a Confederate soldier that talks about how they start at a pretty fair pace and there's just a sense of urgency to get down there because they realize that if they don't get down there in time to help out with the defense, then it's going to be bad for the entire army. With Warren and the 5th Corps crossed, the Union assaults would continue on the 18th. This time, they would see the 5th Corps push on the Jerusalem Plank Road near a position known as Battery 27. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain would be severely wounded in this attack, leading his men toward what was called Fort Hill. Now, when it comes to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, what exactly is fact or fiction in this assault is an interesting subject and might actually be a good topic for a future episode segment. Chamberlain is a polarizing figure, really lending to his legend, especially at Gettysburg, so it's hard to tell, but the 5th Corps attacks would fail. Chamberlain reportedly was given notice from Meade directly that his brigade, made up of all Pennsylvania regiments, some of which were rookie replacements, would attack the rebels alone. The likelihood that number 1, Chamberlain is given this order directly, and number 2, that he gives a 3-paragraph response to the commanding general, was probably false, and something Chamberlain uses to boost his image. What is true, though, is that a ricocheting ball passes through the hip of the hero of Little Round Top, lodging on the other side of his body, a wound many thought was going to be mortal, although Chamberlain would survive to tell people he saved the Union at Gettysburg. Cutler's division was supposed to be seeing support in this attack, but they too would be roughly dealt with, including the Iron Brigade. Rufus Dawes would lament that the attacks were really just some slaughter. Likewise, additional assaults from the 9th Corps would prove a disaster. Wilcox's division would be reduced to only 1,000 men by the end of the day. Toward the end of the 18th, however, we have a fairly tragic and I think emblematic episode of the assault, illustrating what the Union Army is going through from the 15th to the 18th. While Warren has been hesitating on the southern end of the line, the 2nd Corps was urged to begin their assaults again. McAllister's command will be roughly dealt with, leading to Gershom Mott's command to try the Confederates. Leading this assault, which to be fair was supposed to contain some 7,000 to 10,000 men, was going to be the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. Now, on paper, if you are leading this assault with 7,000 to 10,000 men, you're in a pretty strong attacking column, you're targeting a salient in the Confederate line, this could be a successful attack, so it's not necessarily a forlorn hope. As it was, though, the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery would make an attack on the Confederate works unsupported and suffer the greatest loss of life by a single regiment on a single day during the Civil War. 632 of 900 men will become casualties in only 10 minutes. Reportedly attacking from their position on the Prince George Courthouse Road, the other regiments they were brigaded with were veteran units, and not only understood the folly of continuing an attack on the rebel works, but were also to have their enlistments expire. These were New Jersey and Pennsylvania regiments under Gershom Mott. They had been in heavy campaigning since May, so they were at their end. But the main regiment would attack, getting hit by several regiments it was known as Colquitt's Salient, or Colquitt's Redoubt. Now, we should also mention that the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery is not going to be necessarily a rookie regiment, a true rookie regiment, because they had seen action at Spotsylvania, and they'd actually had some pretty heavy casualties, some 200 in that action at Harris Farm. So it's not like they haven't seen combat before. And it's also a misconception that the veteran units demand that the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery lead the assault. The 1st Maine Heavy Artillery is going to have more men, essentially, than a brigade at this point. So they're going to attack in 3 battalion lines. And remember what we talked about in Spotsylvania, in Cold Harbor. There's this thought that if we have a column of attacking troops, if it is well supported, then they will be able to carry a position, especially if they're attacking over relatively short ground. Now, it's not particularly far in which they would be attacking, but if you're not supported properly, if it's just you, and you're getting enfiladed and receiving artillery rounds as well from across the river, that's going to be a problem. Attacking this position was not going to be an easy task. A cornfield leading to a slope was going to be uphill toward the rebels. Before the assault, an officer was offered whiskey and told that they were about to go to hell. He would decline, saying if that's where they were headed, then he would go sober. Now, some of the fellow Union regiments would also jump off, making for a barn. This would be the Hare Farm, but the structure would prove to not be so much of a deterrent for bullets, and so they would retire, meaning they were not quite totally alone. However, once these men were thrown back, the full attention would be on the lead elements of Mott's attack. We have some accounts of the assault. As we scrambled up out of the road, what a sight was before us. About 10 or 1,500 yards away, across an open field, having a little rise and covered with old corn stubble, were the rebel works, bristling with artillery, still as death, awaiting our onslaught. We had become somewhat broken in climbing up and out of the road, and the sight before us, together with a few stray shots from the sharpshooters along our front, did not tend to steady the line. So our old colonel, Daniel Chaplin, who was, I believe, the coolest man that it would be possible to find, gave the command to halt, took his station on a dress parade, ordered his guides on the line, and dressed up the regiment, and then put us through the manual of arms as quietly as though we were still in the defensive of Washington, and all the while the bullets from the sharpshooters humming around his ears like bees. Then came the word, forward, double quick, charge, and with a wild cheer, which seemed to be more like a bitter cry rung out in a death agony, we sprang forward. I saw the works plain before me. I saw the blinding flash of red flame rung along the crest of these works, and heard the deafening crash as the awful work began. Then the air seemed to be filled with all sounds it was possible for it to contain, the hiss of the deadly Minnie-ball, the scream of the shell, the crackle and crash of every conceivable missile, and through it all, the red blaze along the crest of that work which we must cross as we, with bowed heads, breasted that storm. We have another account that's going to speak on Colonel Chaplin. History says that David Birney massed the 2nd Corps and made a desperate charge that day. So he did, but it was the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery that made the charge alone. The rest of the Corps never crossed the sunken road. When I went up the road towards the left, to where the Colonel was, just as General Bertie rode up, and heard him say, "Colonel Chaplin, where are your men?" And I shall never forget his answer. "There they are, out on that field, where your tried veterans dared not go. Here, you can take my sword. I have no use for it now." And the old hero sat down in the road and cried like a child. Just as the night began to close in, the adjutant came along and told us to get together and call the roll. We did. Company I got together. We had gone with 75 men. 6 privates had come out. There was no roll call in that company that night. One of our number wrote that names on a piece of paper, and with tears running down his cheeks, handed it to the adjutant. That was all. Out of the 900 men of the regiment, about 700 had fallen. Late that night, Lieutenant Sam Oakes came to us. He had been knocked senseless on the field, but at night revived and crawled off. How we hugged him and cried him over. His coming saved our company from being wiped out, but the bruises he got that day cost him his life in 1 short year. Our colonel was broken-hearted over the loss and threw his life away at Deep Bottom soon after. He seemed not to care to live after his regiment was gone. So some pretty vivid accounts of the assault and the aftermath. It does actually bring up a good point as well, in that a lot of these men did suffer from their wounds that they received, and sometimes it's not recorded that they actually succumb to these wounds, especially if it's quite a long time afterwards. And I should say as well that really another tragic part of this assault is that once it is over, it kind of caps off the initial Union attacks here at Petersburg. There's not really a whole lot that happens after that. There will be a request of a truce, and Beauregard is going to deny that truce, especially because it's going to be considered to be informal, right? We had this talk early in the episode about formal versus informal, and there's still going to be some maneuvering going on, so he doesn't feel comfortable allowing there to be a truce to collect the wounded from the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. So unfortunately, much in the same way as Cold Harbor, and much in the same way as the Crater, as we're going to see here, the probably most famous attack here at Petersburg, then most of the wounded are going to actually die of their wounds because they're not going to get aid. June 18th would mark the end of the first attacks on Petersburg. 11,000 more Union soldiers will become casualties for the North, compared to approximately 4,000 rebels. Meade, who had arrived to command the field, ordered his army to start digging in. Both sides were going to be prepared for a long haul. So we can bring it to a close there. We covered the move to Petersburg from Cold Harbor, and then had our first assaults on the city. While there will be more action to come around Petersburg in the immediate future, we'll cover that in a few episodes' time. As Lee had pondered, once Grant crossed the river, then it was simply only a matter of time. That being said, we should definitely get comfortable with the idea of being around the Cockade City. Next week, we will shift some gears. We will head back to Georgia and see what's going on in the Atlanta campaign, notably the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.